Thanks for tuning into another video on the channel. Today's project, we're going to be working on the mechanicals of the Volkswagen. Hopefully I can get this into one video. I guess it just depends how many things are broken. So let's get started. I've already degreased the engine. Well, one layer of grease and oil anyway. I've got all of the heavy oil that had run down from the valve cover gaskets cleaned up, and I guess we'll just start going through it. So the things that I know are wrong: it needs a valve cover gasket, and I'm going to do spark plugs. I've already got the wire set for it. I'm going to pull the side cover off of the engine to check the timing belt. I don't know if it has been replaced, so that'll probably have to be done along with a water pump. And the shifter linkage needs to be adjusted because I don't have first or second gear. It only goes into third. That shouldn't be too bad. The shifter linkage is down in there, and then the adjustment nut, you get to it on the underside. So the other thing, the brake fluid reservoir is empty and it has no brakes. So I bought a jug of .3, so I'm going to put it in the reservoir and pump the brakes to see if I can figure out where the brake fluid is going. Hopefully it is not the brake booster, because those seem to be unavailable from every source, whether new, rebuilt, they're unavailable. So hopefully it's not that. But I guess let's start with the brakes, see what's up with that. All right, since I can't figure out what's going on with the brakes up here, I'm just gonna stick it on time lapse, and I'm gonna pull the wheels off. Just quick status update on the brakes. I need pads and rotors on the front. No big deal. Struts, I already knew that. If we go to the back, at least one of the brake problems, I don't know why I have no front brakes, but both of the rear wheel cylinders are leaking. This is all caked in brake dust. The shoes are all oiled over. The drums have been replaced, and it looks like they were replaced pretty recently. And I guess they didn't do the brake cylinders. And from sitting for a couple years, they just kind of went bad. I've had that happen on a few cars, but I'll order wheel cylinders and shoes. The bearings seem to be fine, so I'll repack those, and the drums are fine. I'll clean those up and reuse those, and we'll see if that fixes our brake issue. And I'm going to replace the shocks while I'm back here too. So that's the update on the brakes. So now that I've got that to a point where I can stop, I guess we'll go take a look at the timing belt. Timing belt update. It needs to be replaced pretty bad. It's very cracked on the top side, so add that to the list. But at least the seal behind the sprocket appears to be dry. It's very oily back in here, but it seems to be all running from the valve cover all the way down to the bottom of the engine. So add that to the list. And while I was under the car, I adjusted the shifter, so now I have first gear again. So that should be good to go. But if we move over here, I've got quite a list of parts to order this week. About 90% of my parts came in. Rock Auto shipped pretty quick, and I think 3 days everything was here. The only thing missing, I'm missing an oil filter, air filter, and a couple other filters, but it's not going to hold me up too much. So we got pretty much everything to redo the suspension and all the belts. So I've got the 2 axles here. I've got the struts and the shocks. I've got some new Continental accessory belts. I've got timing belt kit, new strut mounts, upper strut mounts, front and rear. I already had the wire set. Oxygen sensor, rear wheel, wheel cylinders, shoes, pads, rotors, wipers, dipstick because I broke the other one, and speakers for front and back. So that'll keep me busy for a lot of this weekend. So I think I will start probably, it's getting kind of late today, so I'll probably start on the front brakes. Those should be pretty easy. And so far everything has come apart pretty easily. So I can do the front brakes and the half shafts. That shouldn't be too big of a deal. Yeah, put it on time lapse. I'll start on the brakes and do what I can before the end of today. All right, driver's side is done with the half shaft and the brakes. It wasn't really that bad. It took about an hour and a half to do it. And the other side should go faster now that I know all of the tools that I need and how this goes together. The disc brakes are, well, disc brakes are generally pretty easy. This style is a little bit different than what I've used before. And it took me a while to get the clips set correctly because when I took the caliper out of the bracket, they flew off. So I had to experiment. They're offset, and then the ends of the clips are bent different depending on if they're on the top or the bottom or the left or the right. So I had to kind of play around with that. But everything's greased up. I wire brushed it, so everything's moving free. But I'll do the other side. It's the same as this side, so I'm not going to bother recording that. Now I have the passenger side done. It went a lot smoother than the driver's side. And while the half shaft was out, I went ahead and cleaned up the back side of the engine. It had a lot of baked on oil and stuff that I couldn't get the other day. So got that cleaned up. And then when I get to the timing belt, I'll clean up the side of the engine from all of the oil running down from the valve cover. But I think we'll move to the rear brakes now. Oh my God, drum brakes are a pain in the ass, especially on a setup like this where the bearing is part of the whole assembly. 'Cause normally you can just pop the drum off and you're good to go, but on these older Volkswagens, you gotta undo the bearing, and then you have to repack the bearing, and then you have to reset the bearing and everything. So it's kind of a pain in the ass. But this side is done, and it spins nice and free. All right, brakes and half shafts are done. Everything's bled. Got a nice firm pedal again. And, well, I don't have it on the ground yet, so I don't know if anything is actually leaking, but at least nothing is locked up. Everything's spinning free. I've got the front struts out of it. I got to take those over to my buddies today so he can disassemble them, and I can sandblast the lower holders. So I guess it'll sit up on the lift for a few days until I get that done and the struts reassembled. But I guess in the meantime, I've got 2 more of these under hoist safety stands. The top of them screw up and down, so they should be the right height. I can put them under the back and kind of jack up the back suspension and swap the rear, not struts, shocks out of it. Now the lower rear shock bolts turned out to be an unexpected challenge. The bolts were completely seized inside of the bushings, so after a small hammer didn't work, and then a big hammer didn't work, and penetrating oil didn't work, I got out the cutoff wheel and cut off both ends of it, and then cut off what I could, and then got out the vibration saw with a metal blade and just had to go in and cut on the inside of both sides so that I could get the lower shock mount out. So that was kind of like an hour detour. And this suspension rehab is really turning into a pain in the ass. So at the rear, as we saw before, the bolts were completely seized into the bushing, so I had to cut them off. And then on the front, I got the springs out. I went over to my buddies and got those out, and tried to pull the strut insert out of the lower body, and they're just completely stuck in there. So I went on FCP Euro and found the strut and strut body, but it said it's only up through 1984. So it looked the same. And then I went into the Haynes manual and was looking at that. And in the exploded diagram, you have new type and early type. So the early type is up through 84, and everything, so the body and the strut is the same, and I confirmed that the strut insert is common across the early and the late model. So it looks like the only difference is from the strut body up. So as long as I've got new upper mounts, and I'll reuse the spring, so hopefully everything works, and then at least I'll have new struts and lower bodies. All right, the rear shocks are back in it, and if you'll recall, the title of this car says it's an 89, the door sticker says it's an 89, but the rear suspension is actually for the 84 and older style cars. And I know this because in the Haynes manual, it says drop the swing axle down, pull it out, pull the top hat off, swap the springs, reassemble, no problem. I couldn't get the top spring hat off, and I thought it was seized on there, so I said, screw it, I'll just cut the top of the shock off. And when I did that, the hat and some parts of the shock flew off in one direction, and the shock absorber flew out of the spring the other direction. So looking back in the Haynes manual, oh, okay, the 84 and older cars, the spring hat is actually screwed down with a nut, and the spring's under a little bit of compression. Not a lot, you don't need a spring compressor to take it off, but it's a good idea to put it in a vise so that everything doesn't go flying. That would have been nice to know, but it's back together, no harm, no foul. And looking at the ones that came out, they are stamped Volkswagen Audi and made in Germany. I'm pretty sure they're original, so I don't know why this 89 has an 84 or older rear suspension in it. After a quick visit to my neighbor, we were able to get the struts reassembled. So I guess we'll put these up in the car, and then at that point I can put the wheels back on it and lower it down. Before I do that, I've got to tighten the axle nuts, but then I can get it back down on the ground and make sure the top nut on the struts are tightened fully, and make sure the rear is tightened fully. Now that the suspension and brakes are taken care of, I'm going to move the engine. I'm going to start with the valve cover. I've seen some videos on YouTube, it doesn't look too bad, so I'll do the valve cover, spark plugs and wires, and then I'll move on to the accessory belts and the timing belt. Well, I got the valve cover gasket done, and it wasn't too bad of a job. It looks like it has been replaced before, and they didn't use any RTV around the half moons or anything, so it was just pouring oil out of it. According to the manual, said put RTV on both sides of the gasket, so I did that. I put a good amount of RTV in the corners of the half moons. Hopefully it won't leak again as long as I own it, so fingers crossed. And I didn't take any pictures, I was busy doing other things, but this engine is extremely clean inside. There's zero sludge in the head. It looks like it's in great shape. So that part of it's done. So I went ahead and replaced the spark plugs, and Rock Auto has screwed me again. If you've ordered things from there, you may know that their customer service is shit, and it still is. So I ordered spark plugs. It says on their table it's compatible. So I pulled them out, and my mistake, I only looked at this part of the spark plugs and went, okay, looks good, put them in. Only to realize later that the terminal ends are not the same. So the original plugs have just the threaded terminal, and the ones that are listed as compatible are the solid type. So those won't work. I emailed them and they're like, ooh, yeah, sorry, you ordered the wrong ones, not our problem. And I'm out $10, I really don't care about that. But that's the second time they've tried to screw me on parts. But whatever, I'll order some new ones or just go over to Napa and get a set of 4. Now, I'm surprised the car was running as well as it was, because the spec on the spark plugs is a 28 to 32 thousandths gap, and these are close to 50 thousandths. And I suspect they're original. They're Bosch, made in Germany. So I'm guessing they're original, but the car was running fine. It wasn't missing or anything like that. But I'll get some new ones in there along with installing the new plug wires. But next thing I'm going to do is, I think I'm going to move to the timing belt, see if I can do that. Got the timing belt exposed now. I had to take off the water pump pulley and the crank pulley and take out almost all of the bolts for the water pump so it could swing out of the way to get the water pump pulley off. But I got that done, got the timing cover off. I went ahead and turned the engine over by hand. According to the book, there's a line on the cam sprocket, and you line that up with the head. And when I did that, I noticed there's 2 green marks between the intermediate shaft sprocket and the crank sprocket that are marked in green. So whoever did this last time marked those. So that stuff lines up. So I went ahead and marked a spot there and up on the cam between the belt and the sprocket. And then on the new belt, I can put a little mark in each spot just so that I know that I've got the belt in the right tooth on each one. And then these marks and the one on the cam to the head will make sure that these haven't clocked differently while changing this. Timing belt is done and tensioned. I've turned it over by hand twice, or 2 revolutions, and our alignment marks still line up along with the cam mark on the top. Wasn't a bad job at all. Took me a lot longer than somebody who does this for a living, but when I'm working on something that can grenade the engine if it's done wrong, I want to take my time. But we've got a new tensioner, new belt. Everything seems to be fine. And this one's really easy. You don't have to undo the engine mount like on a lot of Volkswagens. So, yeah, somebody skilled in this could probably do it in a half hour, 45 minutes. But I guess I'll go ahead and put the pulleys back on and do the belts. But before I do that, I'm going to put new plugs in it. I've skipped ahead a few steps. I've got the lower timing belt cover on. I've got the pulleys on and tightened. So now it's time to do the belts. And this stuff's all loose. So the only thing I have to do, I just have to undo this nut on the alternator and move it, because I have to replace the small belt first before I can do the other two belts. Then we'll have all new belts. The belts are done, tensioned as they are supposed to be, and that was a pain in the ass. Especially the AC compressor one, there are multiple attachment points for it, and it's very dark in there so you can't really see, but you got a bolt on this side, a bolt on the other side, and then like way down there on both sides, there's a nut that tighten it down so that you can rotate it up and down. And I really couldn't see them that easily, and I went to the Haynes manual, and I might as well just use that thing as toilet paper because it's completely useless. I figured I would go into it and it would maybe have a diagram that says, all right, there's a bolt here, 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 and here, but no, it just says loosen bolts, remove belt. So thanks, that's pretty useless. But the car should be happy now. Should start with no warning lights or anything. I didn't record the extraction, but my next mechanical repair is the O2 sensor. If you recall, the mouse ate the wires off of it, and when I was doing the other stuff, I looked at the O2 sensor and I couldn't figure out how to get it out because it's in kind of a tight spot. It's already out now, but it's way down in there. And what I hoped I could do was to cut the top off of it and put a 22 millimeter socket on it. The problem with that is the socket, if you can see down in there, is only 22 millimeters to about here, and the O2 sensor is quite a bit longer than that. And I cut it off as short as I could, but I didn't have space to get in there with either the vibration saw or the Sawzall or anything. So after looking at it today, I realized that this metal pipe, which was running around it, so the metal pipe sits in there like that, and the O2 sensor sits down in here. So there was really no access with this pipe in there. But then I realized, oh, I can just take the pipe off. It's this little vent tube. So I took that off. It gave me a decent amount of access to this. I still couldn't cut it off any shorter because of access. So I had a O2 sensor removal tool, which I've never had luck with before, but I figured I'd try it again. And what I was able to do was to get it in there clocked about like this. And again, because of access, I couldn't actually use the breaker bar on it. So instead, I was able to take a block of wood and a big ass hammer and just put the block of wood up against this area and just whack it twice, and then it broke loose. And now it's out. I'll go ahead and put the new one in, and it was running fine before, but it smelled a little rich. So with the new O2 sensor, I'm assuming the computer will be happy and it'll run a little better. The O2 sensor is done, everything's buttoned up, all the wire tied back up where it's supposed to be. But before I try to restart it, I'm going to replace the air filter. Since how the battery wasn't bolted in yet, I just pulled it out. And it should just be a few clips. That was pretty painless. Got the air filter in, and it definitely was due for replacement. See if we can tell. I don't think it's an original one, but it's been in there a while. So we've got a new Molly one in there. Got the battery back in it. And like I said, the fuel filter I'm gonna leave for right now. I'll run a few tanks through it. That one is not original, so it's at least it's been replaced at some point. But it should be good to start now. I've checked everything. Everything's cable tied back up where it's supposed to be. Everything's tight. When I was under the car earlier, I did notice that a few of the coolant lines are leaking at their connections. So I guess I've peeled another layer of the onion off of the car, so I'm probably going to go and replace most of the cooling lines, at least the small ones. The large ones, like the main upper and lower radiator hoses, seem to be okay, but I mean, while you're in there, they're not that expensive. You might as well replace all of them. But then it opens up the next question. It's like, well, I'm replacing all the hoses. Do I replace the radiator too, even though it's not leaking? It's, I don't know. I'll worry about that later. But at least the hoses need to be replaced before I start driving it, because three of them are leaking. But let's see if it starts. I think this is a good stopping point for the mechanical overhaul. I'm gonna have to break it into 2 videos because this is dragging on a bit longer than I anticipated. I've got some new issues that have come up. Like I mentioned, the coolant lines are leaking now, so I'm probably gonna replace all of the coolant lines in the front. My valve cover job did not hold very well, so when I was running it a couple days ago, it got up to temperature and then started dumping oil out of this area on the valve cover, so I need to redo that. I'm sure as I was doing it, people were watching and being like, don't do that, don't do that. Well, I did it, so now I need to redo it. And every time I've started this, it sounded a bit lifter ticky, but I wasn't sure because I've never owned one of these, so I don't know what they were supposed to sound like. And a friend of mine confirmed, yes, it did have a lifter tick, but once I got it up to temperature, I shut it off, restarted it, and lifter tick went away. So that's just from sitting for a couple years with oil that is, I don't know how old, but I'll be doing an oil change once I get the oil leak fixed. And the coolant, like I said, I'm going to order the radiator hoses. I'm not going to replace those right away. I'm hoping I can get 50 or 100 miles out of the car before I do those. That way I can see, hopefully the radiator doesn't start leaking and the water pump doesn't start leaking and the expansion tank doesn't start leaking, and then I can just replace the hoses and be done with it. I really don't want to replace the hoses, start driving it, and then find something else is leaking. So with the car sitting for 2 years, seals dry out. It's a 30-year-old car, so things just start leaking from sitting. But I want to put some miles on it before I start firing the parts cannon at it and fixing things. But other than that, I've got to replace, in the next video, let's see, I'll be doing, again, the hoses, valve cover, redo. The transmission shifter seal is leaking, so I'm going to replace that and do a transmission fluid change. And I believe the power steering hose was leaking. I found that the hose clamp was pretty loose, so I tightened that up and hopefully it'll stop that. And once I confirm that's not leaking, I'll change out the power steering fluid as well. And then hopefully the car will behave itself after that. We'll see. So like and subscribe and stay tuned for the rest of the videos.